The war was over. At least that's what the world believed. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice echoed across Japan. The first time his people had ever heard him speak. His tone was soft, distant, almost trembling as he announced Japan's surrender. Millions wept in disbelief. Cities lay in ruins. Hiroshima and Nagasaki smoldered. And for the first time in 2,000 years, the Empire of Japan had bowed its head. But far away from Tokyo, scattered across lonely Pacific islands, some men didn't hear that voice. Others heard it, and refused to believe it. On one such island, hidden under dense jungle and scorching sun, a Japanese officer stepped out of a cave holding a tattered white cloth. His body was thin, his uniform faded, his sword rusted from salt and sweat. He had been fighting for years, surviving on roots, coconuts, and a soldier's unbroken code. Loyalty to the emperor until death. He walked toward the beach where Allied troops waited, lowering his head in silence as he offered his surrender. The battle in his mind had ended. But when he turned back to call for his men, the men he had led through hunger, disease, and nightmares, they refused to come. They shouted from the trees, "Japan will never surrender! Sir, this is a trick." The officer's hands trembled. He had taught them that surrender was shame worse than death. Now his own honor demanded that he live long enough to end the war for them, even if they wouldn't believe him. It was no longer a battle of guns and grenades. It was a battle of faith, identity, and the unbearable weight of duty. This is the story of the Japanese officer who surrendered, but whose men refused to leave. The island was small, barely a speck on the endless blue of the Pacific, a crescent of sand surrounded by jagged cliffs and thick jungle. During the war, it had been a forward outpost of the Imperial Japanese Army, one of hundreds scattered across the Pacific to defend Japan's shrinking empire. But now, in late 1945, it was a forgotten place. The maps in Tokyo no longer marked it with red flags. The empire had fallen, yet deep inside the jungle its ghosts remained alive. The officer's name was Lieutenant Hiroo Tanaka. He was 32 years old, trained in Tokyo, loyal to the core. Before the war, he had studied literature. His teachers remembered him as calm, disciplined, and thoughtful, the kind of man who never raised his voice. But after Pearl Harbor, everything changed. Like thousands of young Japanese men, he volunteered, believing he was serving a divine cause. The emperor was not just a ruler. He was a living god. Tanaka's unit was sent to this remote island in 1944. Their mission was simple: defend it at all costs, cut off from communication. After American bombers destroyed their radios, they lived in the jungle, building bunkers, storing ammunition, and waiting for an invasion that never came. For months, they heard only the distant thunder of war, the explosions of ships beyond the horizon, the faint hum of aircraft overhead. When the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the island trembled, but the men didn't know why. Their last orders had been to hold their ground, to die before surrendering, and so they obeyed. By the time the emperor's surrender message reached the Pacific, it was August 1945. Leaflets were dropped from American planes. Loudspeakers called out in Japanese, "The war has ended. Lay down your arms. Return home." But to Tanaka's men, these were lies, clever traps by the enemy. They had been told the Americans were devils who would torture them, that surrender meant disgrace for their families. Tanaka tried to reason with them. He read the leaflets aloud, showing them the emperor's signature. But his sergeants shook their heads. "The emperor would never surrender," they said. "You've been deceived." The bond among the soldiers ran deeper than command. For years they had eaten from the same pot, buried their dead side by side, shared the same fever under the same tattered tarps. To them, war wasn't over. It was suspended, waiting for the next order. As weeks turned to months, the jungle swallowed everything. Uniforms rotted, ammunition rusted, and the men's skin darkened from sun and dirt. Their faces grew hollow, but their pride remained unbroken. They hunted wild pigs, drank from rainwater pools, and lived by the rhythm of survival. Occasionally, they would spot Allied patrols on the beach, soldiers laughing, swimming, or unloading supplies. To Tanaka's men, these were signs that the Americans were weak, celebrating too early. When the Emperor's reinforcements come, they said, we will drive them back into the sea. But Tanaka knew. Deep inside, he had begun to doubt. He had seen the leaflets showing photographs of Tokyo in ruins, Hiroshima flattened, and the Emperor himself speaking of peace. He had taught his men that obedience was sacred. Yet now his conscience whispered that true loyalty meant ending their suffering. Every night, he wrote in his small, rain-stained notebook, "How can one lead men to surrender when he has taught them never to?" He was trapped between two worlds, one built on faith and duty, and the other collapsing under the weight of truth. By 1946, other islands began to fall silent. Surrendered Japanese soldiers were being repatriated, their faces thin but alive. But Tanaka's island remained unresponsive. The Allies sent messages, leaflets, even Japanese officers with loudspeakers calling their names. Still, no one came out. And then one morning, Tanaka made a decision that would test the meaning of honor itself. He would surrender. Alone. But what he didn't know was that his surrender would only deepen the tragedy. Lieutenant Hiroo Tanaka stood on the edge of the jungle, staring at the ocean. The waves rolled endlessly, whispering a truth his heart had already accepted. Japan had lost. The empire that once promised eternal glory now lay in ashes. His country had surrendered. His emperor had spoken, and yet, in this small corner of the Pacific, the war refused to die. He wrapped a torn white cloth around his rifle, creating a makeshift flag of surrender. His hands trembled as he did it, not out of fear of the Americans, but out of the weight of what it meant. For years he had told his men that surrender was unthinkable, that a soldier's life ended in service to the emperor. But now, as the last officer standing, he knew there was something worse than death. Endless, pointless war in a jungle that no longer mattered. When he emerged from the trees, sunlight struck his face. The American troops stationed on the beach froze, rifles raised. For a brief moment both sides stared at each other, two worlds divided by silence and disbelief. Tanaka bowed deeply. In halting English, he said, "The war, finished." A tall American sergeant lowered his weapon, signaling his men to hold fire. He stepped forward carefully. "You're the officer here?" he asked. Tanaka nodded. "Yes, I come. Surrender." They searched him, took his sword, and offered him water. The taste of it nearly made him weep. He hadn't tasted clean water in months. At the Allied outpost, Tanaka was questioned for hours. The interpreter, a Japanese American from Hawaii, gently asked him the same question again and again. "Where are your men?" Tanaka hesitated. "They are in the mountains," he said softly. "They don't believe the war is over." The interpreter sighed. "Then we must tell them. They'll listen to you." Tanaka looked away. "They will not. They think I am weak now." Still, the Americans wanted peace on the island. They had seen enough blood. So they arranged a small mission. Tanaka would be escorted back to the jungle with a loudspeaker and a radio message recorded by the emperor himself. The hope was simple. If his men heard both their commander and the emperor's voice, they would come out. The next morning, Tanaka climbed aboard an American jeep. His sword was gone, replaced by a microphone. As they neared the jungle edge, he could see the familiar trails, places where his men had built traps, dug foxholes, and hidden their pride among the trees. When the loudspeaker crackled to life, his voice echoed through the jungle. "This is Lieutenant Tanaka. The war has ended. The Emperor has ordered us to lay down our arms. Come out now. You will be safe." The forest remained silent. Only birds answered. Then a single rifle shot rang out. The bullet struck a tree beside the jeep, splintering wood inches from his head. The Americans ducked. Tanaka didn't move. He knew that sound, the crack of a Japanese Type 99 rifle. His men were watching. He raised the microphone again, his voice breaking. "I have seen the flag of Japan lowered. Tokyo is gone. The Emperor has spoken. This is not defeat. It is survival." Another shot, closer this time. And then a voice shouted from the trees, "Lieutenant, if you are alive, fight! If you have surrendered, you are no longer our commander." Tanaka's chest tightened. That voice, he knew it. It was Sergeant Nakajima, his most loyal and fierce soldier, the man who had once saved his life in battle. He took a deep breath. "Nakajima," he shouted back, "listen to me. The Emperor commands it." But the sergeant's reply cut through the air like a blade. "The Emperor would never ask us to live in shame." The Americans wanted to pull him out, but Tanaka refused. "No," he said, "let me try again." For the next several days he stayed near the jungle edge, calling out each morning, pleading for his men to come down. Some nights he could hear them moving, whispering, watching him. They left offerings of food on rocks, tokens of loyalty and confusion. Finally, on the fifth day, he left the safety of the camp and walked alone into the jungle. The Americans watched him vanish into the green darkness, carrying only a small letter and a photograph of his family. Hours passed. Then night fell. In the distance, faint voices echoed, angry, desperate, torn between faith and fear. When dawn came, Tanaka returned. His face was pale, his uniform torn. He carried no weapon. "They will not come," he said quietly. "They would rather die as soldiers than live as men." He handed the Americans a folded paper, a message written by his men. It read, "We thank our commander for his service, but we choose to remain. The war in our hearts has not ended." For Tanaka, those words cut deeper than any wound. He had surrendered to save his men, but in their eyes, he had become the very thing he once warned them against. He looked back toward the jungle one last time, knowing some of them would never emerge. For them, the Emperor's voice had come too late. The sun was a dim red blur behind the jungle canopy when Lieutenant Hiroo Tanaka returned to the American camp for what would be his final attempt. His face was drawn, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights, but his purpose was clear. He couldn't leave them behind, not while they still lived in shadows, believing the Empire was immortal. He told the American commander, "I must go alone. If I take soldiers, they will think it's a trap. If I take weapons, they will think it's war again. I will go as their brother, not as their officer." The Americans hesitated. They had grown to respect him. The quiet dignity in his surrender, the calm steadiness with which he carried his shame. But Tanaka insisted. "If I do not end this," he said, "they will die believing a lie. Let me end it with truth." That afternoon he set out once more, walking barefoot into the humid green maze where his men still clung to a war long dead. The jungle greeted him with the same sounds he had lived with for years: cicadas, wind, the slow drip of rain through leaves. But beneath those sounds lay another rhythm, the quiet pulse of fear. After 2 hours of walking, he reached their camp. It was exactly as he had left it. The bamboo shelters, the rusted helmets, the smoke of small fires rising between trees. And then he saw them. 7 men, bearded and thin, their uniforms little more than rags. They froze when they saw him. One of them, Sergeant Nakajima, stepped forward. His rifle was still in his hands. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "you should not have come back." Tanaka met his eyes. "I had to." "You have surrendered," Nakajima said bitterly. "You bowed to the enemy." "I bowed to peace," Tanaka replied. "The Emperor himself ordered it." Nakajima's jaw tightened. "That voice, the Americans forged it." Tanaka shook his head. "I have seen Tokyo. I have heard the truth. Japan has lost. The Emperor commands us to live, to rebuild. This is not shame. It is obedience." The men looked uncertain. One muttered, "How can we return?" "We will be despised." Tanaka stepped closer. "You will be welcomed. The war is over. Japan needs men like you, men who survived." Nakajima raised his rifle slightly. "You taught us that surrender is death, that our duty is to die fighting. Were those lies?" The lieutenant's voice broke. "They were what I believed then. But belief does not feed the dead. You think dying is loyalty? No, living is harder. Living means carrying the truth." The wind rustled through the palms. For a moment no one spoke. Then Tanaka reached slowly into his jacket and pulled out a small radio. one the Americans had given him. "I brought this," he said. "You will hear the Emperor's voice with your own ears." He turned the dial. Static filled the air. And then, faint but unmistakable, came the words that had changed Japan. "To all my subjects, I desire that you, my loyal soldiers, lay down your arms and bear the unbearable, to preserve peace for future generations." The men froze. Nakajima's hands trembled. For years that voice had been sacred, a voice none of them had ever heard. Tanaka spoke softly. "He commands peace. Will you disobey him now?" Silence. Then one by one the men lowered their rifles. Tears welled in their eyes, streaking through the dirt and exhaustion. But Nakajima still hesitated. His whole life, every act of courage, every friend buried, every scar, had been built on the idea that Japan would never kneel. To surrender now meant that all of it had been for nothing. Tanaka stepped closer. "Nakajima," he said gently, "the Emperor asks us to live, not to die for ghosts." For a moment, Nakajima's weapon wavered between them. Then with a long, broken exhale he dropped it to the ground. The sound of the metal striking the soil was louder than any gunfire. The other soldiers followed. 8 men, once enemies of the world, stood together under the gray sky, their heads bowed, not in defeat, but in release. Tanaka whispered, "It's over." They walked together toward the beach, each step shedding the weight of years. When they emerged from the jungle, the American guards stood in silent respect. There were no cheers, no mockery, only quiet understanding. The war that had outlived peace had finally ended. For Lieutenant Tanaka, it wasn't victory. It was something far more fragile: forgiveness. The sun rose quietly over the Pacific the next morning, a pale golden light spilling across the sea. On the beach, the Japanese soldiers stood in a line, heads bowed, eyes lowered, as the American troops watched in silence. The war had ended months ago, but for these men, peace was brand new, strange, and almost painful. They were thin, hollow, their skin darkened by years of jungle sun. Yet there was something unbroken in the way they carried themselves. Even now they saluted the imperial flag as it was folded and handed to them, no longer as a symbol of conquest, but of memory. Lieutenant Hiroo Tanaka stood apart, gazing at the horizon. He had done what he set out to do, brought his men home from the wilderness of belief. But he couldn't shake the thought that in doing so, he had betrayed everything he once stood for. When the ship came to take them away, Nakajima approached him quietly. "Sir," he said, "I was wrong. You were brave, braver than all of us." Tanaka nodded, his voice almost a whisper. "No, I only did what the Emperor asked, to live." The men boarded the ship, bound for Japan. As the island faded behind them, it was as if the last piece of the old empire sank beneath the sea. The jungle would reclaim their bunkers, their flags, their dreams of victory. But the story of their survival, of a commander who chose humanity over pride, would linger far longer than the sound of any gunfire. When they arrived in Japan, the world they returned to was unrecognizable. Cities reduced to rubble, streets filled with orphans and beggars, and an emperor no longer divine but human. The soldiers faced questions, shame, even disbelief. Some refused to speak of what had happened. Others quietly rebuilt their lives, taking jobs as farmers, teachers, or merchants. Lieutenant Tanaka never returned to the military. He moved to a small coastal village, where he taught school children about literature, the same subject he had once loved before the war turned words into weapons. He rarely spoke about the island. But in his old notebook, found years later by his grandson, he had written a single line: "The hardest war is not the one fought with bullets, but the one fought within." In time, Japan's long silence about its soldiers began to break. Stories like Tanaka's surfaced, of men who kept fighting for years after 1945, refusing to believe the empire had fallen. Some were discovered decades later, still wearing their uniforms, still saluting an emperor who had long since passed away. Each story carried the same haunting echo, the human struggle between loyalty and truth. Tanaka's act, surrendering not to the enemy, but to reality, became a quiet symbol of a nation learning to live again. His decision didn't erase the suffering nor the guilt, but it showed that even in defeat, there can be dignity. For him, the war ended not with a gunshot, but with a choice. The choice to stop fighting ghosts and start listening to life again. And as the waves rolled endlessly across the Pacific, over forgotten graves and rusted helmets, one truth remained. In every war, there comes a moment when courage is not about dying, but about choosing to live.